Welcome to the AWL 2020 conference, Vision in Focus. My name is Charmaine Tsang. I am the AWL Director for Western Australia. I acknowledge that I am hosting this session, Career Vision, Seizing the Opportunities Now Available on Whadjuk Noongar country. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Australia. AWL gratefully acknowledges our sponsors, College of Law, Specsavers and Barmer Agency. This conference would not be free to attend without their support. AWL is delighted to have in this session Libby Lyons, the Director of the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, and Felicia Tan, Director of TSMP Law Corporation, who joins us from Singapore. You can read their impressive profiles in the conference program. We have set aside 10 minutes for questions, so if you would like to ask our panelists a question, please post it to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens. But we are loving the chatter between the delegates in the chat function. So let's get started. Libby, as the Director of WGEA, you oversee the statutory reporting process that gathers gender equality data for more than 10,000 employers covering more than 4 million employees. We know that while women make up more than 50% of the Australian legal profession, representation in leadership roles remains a concern. Can you share with us what the data says about women's representation in the legal profession, particularly at leadership levels, and what role flexible working arrangements play in enabling gender equality?
Thank you, Charmaine, and thank you for having me here today. It's an absolute treat. I think it's particularly poignant that I'm here today because it is Equal Pay Day in Australia. This day marks the 59 extra days on average that women need to work to equal the average annual earnings of men. So it's a really great day to be here. I wish we could celebrate Equal Pay Day, but of course, we should be commiserating about it, and I think, you know, it is a stark reminder that women across the world still face many barriers to getting into the workplace. It is particularly the case for women in the legal profession. As you said, the legal profession has, the sector in Australia is made up of 68.9% female members, 31.1% of males, and in our data set it covers roughly 29,500 employees. The pay gap in the legal sector is much greater than the national average, which is a disappointment. It's currently sitting at 25.1% for total remuneration. So that includes bonuses, shift allowances, those sorts of things, other discretionary pay that people in the legal services industry may get. Then the national average pay gap, according to our data set, is 20.8%. So, you know, it's nearly 5 percentage points higher than that. What I will say is I like looking for the positives, and the positives in this instance is that the pay gap has declined by 10 percentage points over the 6-7 years that we've been collecting data. So well done to employers for that, but we've still got a way to go. When it comes to women in leadership, again, legal services industry is not faring so well. Women make up just 17% of CEOs or managing partners across the sector. That is about the same as CEOs in general across the whole of the nation. But interestingly, again, like the stats, there are more women actually in management roles. So 54.5% of all managers in the legal sector are women. but I think it also reflects that women sort of dominate in the administrative areas as well. So the data certainly shows that women comprise the majority of junior professional levels, and women last year comprised 57.8% of all appointments into the legal services industry, and that included promotions to manager positions. So it shows that there is a very strong pipeline of women into management levels, which is well above the national average of 43.8%. But when it comes to getting those top roles of managing partner or CEO, you know, they're falling off the cliff. So flexible work, of course, is terribly important. And I think this whole COVID pandemic has proved both to the legal sector and every other sector that, you know, flexible work, particularly working from home, is actually achievable. You can still get your work done and work from home, even if you're homeschooling. And there are many, many female and male lawyers out there that are doing just that. But I think we have to also become careful that we don't make working from home synonymous with flexible work. It's not. There are lots of other ways of flexible working. Job sharing is one, and I know many legal firms that have people job sharing. Very effective way of flexibly working. Different start and finish times. It doesn't suit everybody to start at 8 and finish at 5 or 6. Some people, it suits them better to work later in the day. And again, I think that we've proved that through this whole COVID crisis. So I think that the important thing going forward, and as we move out of the pandemic, for law firms in particular to look at different ways of flexible work to ensure that men engage in flexible work. And one way to do that is to set targets and to measure those targets, particularly for the take-up of men working flexibly. A lot of other things to talk about, but I'll leave it there, Charmaine.
Thank you for those insights, Libby. So Felicia, we've just heard about the importance of flexibility, but in the legal profession in particular, there can be a stigma around it. There can be a perception that if you ask for a flexible working arrangement, you are not as serious or as committed to your career or to your career progression, or a view that some areas of law, such as commercial litigation or tight turnaround M&A transactions or IPOs, that they can't be performed flexibly. And as Libby says, and the experience of all law firms was, that COVID-19 resulted in all law firms adopting a work from home model. You're a director of a firm that specialises in both corporate and commercial litigation and corporate and commercial transactions. Can you speak, firstly, to the perceptions around flexible working and the practice of law? Secondly, to any observations around the gendered effect of COVID-19 working from home arrangements? And finally, to any challenges or opportunities that the recent work from home experience creates for the profession.
Thank you, Charmaine. I echo Libby's thanks to the organizers for this invite. And also, while it's not Equal Pay Day in Singapore today, it coincidentally is the day of when the Women in Practice Committee of the Law Society of Singapore, for the first time, has published a gender diversity report. So, and this is the first time in our 55 years of nation building history. So it is quite an important day for us as well. And we're very happy to share this with the rest of the participants online today. On the question of perception, I would love it if there wasn't that perception, but you're absolutely right. It is a traditional perception that has remained, I think, in law firms, that if you are on a working arrangement which doesn't require you to come into office every day, then perhaps the output is affected, or maybe you're not as inclined or interested in the output or the productivity. I think that is an outdated, it's needless to say, it's an outdated perception. And I think this COVID pandemic has presented not just, I think, Singapore law firms, but law firms around the world with the perfect opportunity to overcome that perception. But it needs a lot of training, because while we talk about law firms, they're essentially made up of people. It's individuals you need to reach out to. You need to share with them that it's, first you need to show them, I think, and the best way is to show with the use of technology that the output has not actually been in any way affected negatively. In fact, I think productivity is in certain cases at an all-time high, because if you think about it, per day you at least conserve anything between 2 to 4 hours of getting up, whether it's getting up and getting out of your house and just getting onto transport, or just getting up, the typical get yourself well dressed, well made up to attend in court or in an office. You've got all that time which you can then redeploy to balance other commitments. And I share this anecdote sometimes. I think the problem with that perception, and which ties in with this, which is the second question you asked, but I'm going to link them together. You asked whether there's a problem about working arrangements being flexible, and one of the problems is the erosion of personal space. So I think while we want to overcome that perception, we need to balance it with setting boundaries for the rest of the team you work with, and that includes either your seniors, your peers, those you train, as well as your clients. I think we need to set certain parameters, and everyone's is different. I'm not here to prescribe a particular say work time, just like Libby said. Not everyone does an 8 to 5, not everyone does a 10 to 6 or 10 to 7. You've got your own parameters. So if you set certain expectations and you have a trust relationship with who you work with, and inform them of what's necessary for you so that you can balance, and you don't want burnout. So the purpose of balancing your personal space is so that when you do actually perform the work, you actually continue to deliver the high quality that's always been associated with you. So I think that's important, but at the end of the day, the most important thing is conversation, because I think traditionally for law firms, there is this sense of presenteeism. If you're not there, you don't see the person in the office, perhaps they're not working. Again, I think the COVID pandemic, the upside, I like to look at the positive sides of things as well. And the upside is, I think it's done away with that need to physically see someone. We're all still seeing each other now, as you see Charmaine and Libby across the screen. But in the past, if you ever suggested that, I think anytime, not just even 2 years ago, say 3 months ago, you suggested to someone that let's only see each other for the next 6 months over the screen, everyone's going to think, are you someone who just, are you antisocial, or are you just not someone who likes to get as involved and committed with the rest of the team? But now I think that's changed, and we need to embrace that. So we need to educate those we work with, and that includes against the clients, that this is the way forward. Technology is not going to subside and go away just after the pandemic. It's here to stay. So we should actually embrace that. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm not going to hog the screen. Returning to Charmaine.
Thank you for your insights, Felicia. And what we want to do today is to provide our attendees with some practical steps that they can take. So I'll ask this next question to both speakers, firstly to you, Libby. Because of COVID-19, organisations throughout the world had to embrace change. And as Felicia said, the challenge for our profession is to ensure we don't return to how things were done before the pandemic, and that we continue to challenge the perceptions that Felicia spoke about. And as you mentioned, that's around the where, the when, and also the how we work. So do you have any practical steps, Libby, that we can take to change the perception around flexible working arrangements?
I think the amazing thing is that across the world we have learned that we can make structural change overnight. That, you know, it's very easy to make structural change. Well, it's not easy, but structural change can be made if it has to be. So to think that we will revert back to the way we worked before is a nightmare. So we need to ensure that we all keep talking positively about the way we're working now, about the way we can continue to work, and the way we must work in the future. But I think the really important thing to recognise here is that to change a workplace, you have to change the culture. And changing the culture of an organisation is terribly difficult. And if we also accept that the culture of any workplace is determined and driven by the board and the executive, then the legal profession really has a lot of work to do. Because if we go back to that figure that I mentioned before, where only 17% of managing partners and CEOs are women, you know, it's going to take us a long time to get some balance there. And in order to get that, you know, we need that balance before we can, or somewhere near that balance before we can start driving this cultural change. The same applies to equity partners and boards. The majority of them are men. So what we need to do is, as women, we need to be consistent in what we do and say. We need to encourage our male colleagues to embrace flexible work, to look at different ways of working flexibly. We need to encourage law firms to provide equitable access to parental leave. Now, leading practice in Australia now is that you provide the same amount of paid parental leave to men as you do to women. We know that those early childhood years are important, and children need fathers in their lives. So the father's input is just as important as the mother's input. So therefore, that equitable access to parental leave is vital. So we need to keep talking, to working with our diversity and inclusion committees to make sure that that happens. We need to question our managers and our senior managers as we move through the pandemic into this really tough economic phase we're going to. We need to challenge the way they may have to downsize. It's very easy for employers to pick the low-hanging fruit as you're having to downsize, and that usually means removing the part-timers. And women work part-time at 3 times the rate of men. So it's always the women that are going to be discriminated against here. And I think it's up to us all to be brave and to challenge some of these decisions as we see them come up. So I think it's about sticking to the course, ensuring that we engage with men and encourage men to work flexibly, take the parental leave that is available to them, to call out poor behaviour when we see it in the workplace, and to ensure that we keep shining a spotlight on gender equality, because the evidence from the research we do is unequivocal. Gender equality is good for business. And if law firms can get that balance right, they will be streets ahead of their rivals. And law firms are very competitive from my knowledge of them and from my working with them. So there are just a few things we can do.
Thank you, Libby. And I'll ask the same question of you, Felicia. So COVID-19 resulted in all law firms working from home, which demonstrated to the profession that by and large the practice of law can be successfully performed both remotely and flexibly. What practical steps do you suggest we take to change the perceptions around the where, the how, and the when lawyers work, so that we seize the opportunities now available?
I think it's very important that women lawyers have to speak up and speak up more, because I think in going forward, we're going to be using virtual networks for a lot of business. So that's the first point. But it's very easy to lose people in your team or neglect people when you don't see them. So for instance, there is, I think, also one advice I would give is a practical one, and sounds very simple, but people forget. Turn on their videos if they're participating in a business meeting, because it might be 6 months before you next see the person in person, in the flesh. You know, it's nice to be reminded of who you are. And if for various reasons, say you happen to be in the commute and you couldn't actually turn on your video, perhaps have a profile picture there. It's something we share with everyone I work with as well. So at least people know who they're speaking to, because it's very different when you're just seeing names. Of course, webinars aside, there's a reason we can't see 1,000 people or 250 people on screen at the same time, and we don't want to. You just look like midgets on screen. But otherwise, please get the face time over the virtual networks. Virtual networks are not meant to take away your interaction. They're meant to facilitate interaction. But very often, I think people shy away from speaking. The other thing is, when it's on a virtual network, you sometimes it's not spontaneous anymore. We lose that ability to just spontaneously interrupt someone. You sort of have to find a polite window to unmute your screen so that you can speak. So again, Don't let that keep women lawyers away from speaking up in a business meeting where there are lots of perhaps high-powered men who leave their perhaps microphones on the entire time and just treat it in the old-fashioned way. Just voice out that they need to speak. If you can't get your word across, type it into the chat box or raise your hand. Do something about it so that you can speak, because I find there is a real risk that women forget to show themselves once it's our entire interaction is taken virtual. That's one. The other thing is, I would encourage everyone who, if anyone is actually not yet fully acquainted with technology, please do. And also understand the differences if you are logging into a network from your phone versus your computer. So it's the same application you're using, but very often there are limitations depending on the device you're using. So I don't think in the next couple of months it's going to be, while it might be acceptable at the start when this pandemic started, it's not going to be as acceptable if you rock up and say, I couldn't get my screen to work, or I couldn't get something to work, so I'm so sorry I had to sit out the entire hour of meeting. That's just, well, people are going to tell you that's perfectly fine, we understand. That's just going to undercut your ability to progress on that particular matter or file. And when I said earlier to speak up, I also mean speak up in work allocation, because it's very often work allocation used to typically be done in the office by literally someone seeing you're there suggests that you have time, which is not actually correct. The fact that you're in the office doesn't mean you have capacity, but it used to be synonymous. And so someone says, take this file. That ability to literally just hand you a file is gone with working remotely or working even part-time. In any form of flexible working arrangement, there's always that gap period where you don't see the person who's in charge of giving you a file, or you don't see the client who's thinking, should I go to this firm or that firm? You don't see them. So it's very important to be extremely proactive, more proactive than the past, to actually communicate, one, that you have capacity to those you work with and are in charge of assigning matters to you, or two, reaching out to clients, even just if it's a care call, it's not a work call, just to ask how are they, to let them, remind them, just one, you're alive and kicking, and two, you have the appetite for work. I think that's very important. And I'm just going to wrap up with a short answer. I think someone in the chat shared something that comes very close to me. Someone shared about the possibility that when we go back to office after this pandemic sort of, I don't know what's the right word for it because I'm not sure when it will end, but let's say when we all move back gradually to the office and work more from the office, are the men going to congregate in offices and network, and the opportunities then available to men will then be very different from women who are still working remotely? I would address that in two ways. One, I don't think we can stop that from happening. It's always going to happen as long as we can't change men wanting to get together for a beer. In fact, women do as well like to get together for perhaps a cocktail. So we can't stop that. But what I think what we need to do is adapt. And I think women, one of our strengths is the fact that we are excellent at multitasking. Simply because I think traditionally a lot has been expected of women, many different commitments. We've been very well accustomed, we may like it or not, but we are very well adapted to having to multitask and also to actually come up with problem solutions. So I would suggest embracing networking over the internet. We've been doing that for months, setting up within the women's networks, you will all have them. Arrange for catch-up sessions with your in-house clients who are women. Invite them to bring their male counterparts. I find very often if you suggest that each one has to bring one male counterpart, you grow your network that way. And you are lending the other party a chance to do someone else a favor as well. So it grows the network. I don't think we can solve the problem of people going back to office. We can't, but we can create our own solutions.
Thank you for those practical tips, Felicia. We'll move on to questions now. We've got a few come through. Libby, you mentioned earlier about downsizing and removal of part-timers. With less time being spent in the office, where there's a flexible working model, do you see some firms move towards a contracting consultant or a casual employee model? And if so, what are the implications for women lawyers?
Look, that's a really interesting question. And if you look at past economic downturns, recessions, then full-time work absolutely drops. In particular, men have lost jobs at a greater rate than women, but as we come into the recovery, men pick them up quicker too. I think there is a very real risk of law firms moving to a consultancy model or, a casual workers model. it will be interesting to see if it actually happens, because the casual work model, the consultancy model, doesn't always promote loyalty, staff engagement, and those sorts of things. And it can often work against people being more productive and happy employees. So I think there's always a tendency to do it. We've got to watch it. We have to keep an eye on it, and that's the beauty of collecting data. We can keep an eye on those sorts of things. But what I would say to employers is that when you are looking at how you are managing your workforce, you must have at top of mind that you cannot discriminate more against one gender than the other. Please ensure that you are not discriminating against your female employees.
Thank you, Libby. And this one I'll address to you, Felicia. Does billing on an hourly basis act as a systemic barrier to more women progressing in law firms?
I think the billing by hourly rates has always been a problem for any candidate that's stronger than the other. I don't think it's even just a women lawyer versus male lawyer problem. It doesn't reward the fastest, most efficient worker. In fact, it's counterproductive, because you then end up having the lowest billable hours in the firm if you were just best at your work. So in fact, there has been clarion calls around, not just in Singapore, but the region in Asia, for movement towards other billing models, whether it be on a per project basis or whether it's on some other basis. And I think in-house consumers of legal services have embraced that very much. I'm starting to see a decline in interest in what my billable hours are, or even what my hourly rates are. Very often they just want to know, if this piece of work gets to your firm, how much am I going to spend? I just need to budget for it. So I think we will gradually, as a profession, move away slowly but steadily from billable hours, or at least billing and judging someone purely on billable hours. But let's address those who haven't yet moved towards it, or haven't recognized this and still prefer, because they grew up in the billable hour age, and so they continue rating their employees that way. I think what's important to remind them, or to try and move them forward, is to try and take steps such as attributing a certain value to otherwise intangible work you do. So business development is one. I think in what I call progressive firms, very typically they set key performance indicators for their employees, whereby business development should at least take up 20 to 40% of their time. Because at the end of the day, legal professions, law firms are still businesses. So giving a value to that, I think, would help. Of course, other things would be really sort of perhaps attributing an intangible value to, say, pro bono work that we do, because typically, again, it's non-billable. But very often, young lawyers cut their teeth in the pro bono work that they do. Not suggesting that in any way the quality is different, but it's just that they still have that drive and the spirit, and they cut their teeth, because very often, if it's a high profile, high paying client, there are demands from the management of your clients who actually wants the senior partner on the file. The junior doesn't get the chance to be the first chair. So, and I must say, because in Singapore, it's a fused profession. So very often I speak both for the barristers and the solicitors at the same time, because that's what we are. But essentially, I think the concept is the same. It's about the communication, and also I think gradually we will move away from billable hours.
Thank you, Felicia. We're close to the end of the session. Libby and Felicia, do you have any final comments you'd like to leave with our attendees?
I'd just like to add to what Felicia said there about billable hours. I think they absolutely discriminate against women. I always thought they have discriminated against women. And I think it's time that law firms started to take a little bit more risk when it comes to billing clients. As a client, I need certainty around what something may cost. I get certainty if I go to an architect. I get certainty usually if I go to an accountant. I need some certainty from my my legal advisors as well. So I think we've got to move away from billable hours.
Felicia?
I
think on that note, I would just say, I think for lawyers, we often limit ourselves and how we progress if we self-check too much. And I think it's a strength. We tend to reflect very much on us. But I think in this day and age where a lot of, I repeat earlier something I said about work assignments, they're going to literally, in the past it was the first person you see when you round the corridor in the office. Now it's probably the first hand you see raised virtually on a chat, in the chat itself. So, and because we are very often contemplative, and I say this, and I know I'm at risk of stereotyping, and I apologize in advance, but it's just something I think that customarily, especially I think Asian women, as I speak for myself, we're so trained to think very hard about, are you sure you're capable of doing this? Do you want to say yes? And in the couple of seconds that you've thought about it, someone else who has, typically a man, who is interested in a piece of work, has just risen his hand, and he's probably going to knock on your door later to ask you for some advice on how to deal with that. But he's asked for that piece of work first. So my parting sort of, I guess, feedback from me would be, I strongly encourage everyone to consider volunteering for something you want to do a bit quicker, and trust in yourself that you will somehow be able to handle that.